times more likely to be arrested for drug crimes. Judge Samaniego, can you speak to the experiences and interactions you've had with migrant families and asylum seekers at the border? What is the real life impact that such anti-migrant rhetoric and misinformation have on these communities?
Well, it's just, it's heartbreaking, obviously, that why they're coming in, they want to work. I'll give you an example. We've had individuals that were held back because they got caught up in, not being able to go back because of Title 42. And they were asking for, give us brooms, give us bags. We want to help us. We do not want to be perceived as lingering or burdening your community or any part of the country. And they talk a lot about the fact that they're wanting to work, they're passionate about working, and they're ready to do something for our country. We do not get, I interact with them completely. I work with the unaccompanied children, and I have a lot of exposure, and I feel extremely confident that the majority of them have no interest in drugs or doing anything like that other than to work and to participate and be part of the dream that they're looking for. And a lot of them, like I said, they're coming out of desperation of how they're treated in their countries, how they're persecuted, and they're looking for a better life. I do not, I stand here saying, with all honesty, that I do not see or understand some of the things that are said here today about them wanting to be part of drug cartels or putting them in that situation. It's just completely opposed to what I've experienced there in El Paso.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, Judge.
Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates.
Yield to Mr. Roy.
I thank the gentleman from Florida. I thank the witnesses for being here. I just want to clarify the record here for a second. The idea that the fact that fentanyl is caught at ports of entry and that is the only place that is coming through is belied by the facts, and is belied by the facts that the Border Patrol is now distracted processing human beings, just as the judge from El Paso just described, but just ignores the impact on what that does to the actual border. The Border Patrol can't possibly catch all of the fentanyl at the ports of entry, nor catch the fentanyl between the ports of entry. Mr. Daniels, do you agree with that assessment?
I do. We've had a depletion in Border Patrol because they've been taken to other areas where processing is more important.
And is it your experience that fentanyl pours in between the ports of entry and that fentanyl does in fact get into our communities in mass quantities today due to our open border?
Yes.
I appreciate that. Now, Mr. Dunn, obviously in the introduction, I talked about you being from the county in which I live, in Hays County. You testified, Mr. Dunn, earlier that it was not just Noah who passed away in Hays County last year due to fentanyl poisoning in our community. Is it not true that 3 other Hays Independent School District students died from fentanyl overdoses in our community in Hays County last summer? Is that accurate?
That's correct. And a 4th 14-year-old died in January of this year.
Just a couple of weeks ago.
Yes.
Another
And
family.
during the Christmas break, 6 other students were poisoned by fentanyl, but they were successfully saved.
And last summer, there were another 8 who were brought back through the use of Narcan. Is that correct?
Correct.
Mr. Dunn, your lovely bride, Janelle, is Hispanic, yes?
Yes.
Do you believe that believing in a secure border makes one racist or anti-Hispanic?
Not in the slightest. Her family actually holds that same position.
I thank you for that. You guys have been active now in a number of organizations trying to get out and understand the lost voices of fentanyl. Is that right?
Yes.
Worked with Ms. Virginia Krieger.
Yes.
And she's lost her daughter due to Percocet that was laced with fentanyl. Is that correct?
Yes.
And the people that have been the lost faces of fentanyl, and I've done this before. Noah is one of these lost voices due to fentanyl now.
He is now. I'm not sure if he's included in that picture.
And these pictures are the faces of Americans who are no longer with us due to fentanyl flowing throughout our communities. Now, these are young individuals who are not here today. Now, Noah's not here today. Do you care precisely whether or not fentanyl is coming through ports of entry or between ports of entry? Or was your family directly impacted because fentanyl is flooding into our communities one way or the other?
However it gets here, it's here.
And in your experience talking to other family members and talking to law enforcement personnel, is it your observation and belief that the overwhelming flood at our borders, distracting Border Patrol from being able to carry out their duty to stop the flow between the ports of entry or do inspections at the ports of entry, is resulting in more fentanyl pouring into our communities that is then resulting in the death of Americans and, in fact, the death of migrants in the process?
Yes, most of the fathers that I speak with that are not as vocal as the mothers, the common thing they've expressed to me is to come up here and let people know that it's a border issue. It's not an immigration issue. It's flooding across the borders because there's a problem at the borders.
In your communication with families who have lost loved ones due to fentanyl poisonings, do you believe that it is an imperative that this country's federal government, who has a constitutional obligation to secure the border of the United States, do so in order to ensure that we stop the flow of fentanyl and dangerous and illicit narcotics into the United States, resulting in the death of Americans?
Yes.
Do you believe that if this country adopted policies that enabled us to restrict and stop the flow of fentanyl, and that includes ensuring that we have no longer a flood of human beings at our border, while still maintaining asylum laws and protecting people who are being persecuted under actual threat of persecution for their religious and political beliefs, do you believe that stopping the flow of individuals, enabling Border Patrol to stop fentanyl, that is a critical imperative, and if that were adopted, would help save lives like Noah's?
I do, and most others that I talk with feel the same way.
Thank you, Mr. Dunn. Thank you, Janelle. I yield back.
Time has expired. The gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses, and particularly thank you, Mr. Dunn, for being here. And I too join my colleagues and expresses our condolences for your unspeakable loss. Mr. Chairman, the House Republican Border Security Plan is one of the most extreme stances this body has seen on immigration in recent history, and that's saying something. It's so extreme that dozens of Republican members oppose it, and some have even called it un-American. The Republican plan would effectively shut down asylum, including families fleeing communism, totalitarian regimes, and unaccompanied children desperately seeking refuge. This is not only a moral failing to asylum seekers fleeing persecution, it also defies existing laws. We have obligations under international agreements and U.S. domestic law to accept and protect asylum seekers. We can't just ignore these obligations because some want to prey on anti-immigrant and xenophobic sentiments to gin up political support. This is sadly an ongoing and blatant attempt by our Republican colleagues to use fear tactics to scare us into turning immigrants away and to demonizing people coming here in search of a better life. We cannot and should not do that. Democrats have put forth proposals that will actually help fix our broken immigration system and secure our borders in a safe and humane way. We've proposed legislation that addresses the root causes of migration, improves border security, and creates additional legal pathways for people to enter the United States. In fact, the 2023 Omnibus Bill, which we passed in December, even included funding to help Customs and Border Patrol stop dangerous cartels, the actual cause of drugs being smuggled into the country, not asylum seekers, by the way, but our House Judiciary Republicans unanimously opposed the bill. So yes, there's a crisis at the border, but it's not the one that the Republican leadership is shouting about. And so, Judge Samaniego, I want to ask you, in your capacity as El Paso County Judge, you meet with many migrants who enter the United States via the El Paso port of entry, and you work very hard to ensure that they're treated with dignity here in the United States. Can you describe what your sense is of why these migrants are entering the U.S., and are they in fact seeking asylum?
I'd like to comment about Border Patrol, and that is, we've been talking about what they have to do, and you're pushing them to do other things. And I can tell you that if we weren't doing our jobs, and I said earlier, we're pushing that back to them. Very limited, space is limited, personnel is limited, and we're pushing it back to them. But like I said, we deal a lot, El Paso deals a lot with migrants, and we interact tremendously. We get to see them at shelters. We get to see them at the point of entry. And they're wanting to come here to work, and they're wanting to do something for our country. And I have to stress that we are very, we're very lucky, the things that they want to do and the things they want to maintain and the values that they have for the United States. It's just remarkable that under all the circumstances that they go through, they come to our country with tremendous amount of passion to be part of our value system.
And Judge, what kinds of resources do border counties like yours need to ensure that local officials are able to adequately protect public health and safety, while also ensuring that migrants are treated with dignity and processed quickly and efficiently and consistent with our values as the great democracy we are? What more can we do as a federal government to help you do the excellent work that you are doing in El Paso?
The most important thing that we've seen is decompression. That we need the Border Patrol to be able to decompress and allow us to process. And so sometimes, like I said, we're not funded properly. We cannot process properly. And then that's when you have people or buses going into communities that are not ready for them. Obviously, we need shelter. Most of the migrants will move out within 72 hours. And I can tell you that not even 1% of the migrants ever stay in our community. And they're moving to other directions. They've got sponsorship. So we really need that support of being able to have shelter for them so that we can accommodate them. Like I said, 40% already have sponsors and they can move quickly, but the others, it takes us about a day, maybe 72 hours to be able to process them, redirect them. And then I can tell you that most of them are going to be US citizens. And if you treat them wrongly, they'll remember that. If you treat them properly and you treat them with respect and humanity and humanitarianism, these are going to be part of our residents, part of our citizens. And this is the first face that they have with our country. And I want to be able for them to keep that excitement, have that respect for America. And you do that by treating them properly. So we need shelter, we need food, and we need to be able to use our strategy. Our strategy works. And I wish that someone would take the time to look at what we do for 4 years now. We've been working on this strategy.
The gentleman's
you,
time
Judge.
has expired. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I think this discussion has brought out something that the Border Patrol officers told me when I toured the border in the Yuma sector recently. Don't send us more money, they said. They'll only use it to process illegals faster into this country. And I think that the testimony has been bringing that out very clearly today. Since Joe Biden canceled the Remain in Mexico policy and ordered ICE not to enforce court-ordered deportations and abandoned the border wall and signaled to the world that America's borders no longer mattered, we've seen 1.7 million illegal aliens deliberately admitted into this country, and another 1.2 million known gotaways have entered while the Border Patrol's been overwhelmed changing diapers and taking names. Now, that is an illegal alien population of 2.9 million. That is the entire population of the state of Mississippi, just since this administration changed these policies and precipitated this crisis. And as the Democrats' witness testified, illegal aliens are now being rapidly and efficiently trafficked by our government to every community in our nation. What the Democrats have never explained is how our schools are made better by packing classrooms with non-English speaking students, how our hospitals are made more accessible by flooding emergency rooms with illegals demanding care, how our social safety net is strengthened by adding millions of impoverished and dependent individuals to systems that are already strained to the breaking point, how our neighborhoods are made safer by introducing violent cartels into our communities and making it impossible to deport criminal illegal aliens, how our nation's made safer as known terrorists are encountered entering our country in record numbers, how our children are made more secure with fentanyl pouring across our border, or how working families are helped by flooding the labor market with cheap illegal labor. This is the nightmare that the Democrats have unleashed upon our country. I asked the same group of Border Patrol agents in Yuma, what laws could we write that would help them? And they said unanimously, the first thing we need to do is enforce our existing laws. This administration clearly doesn't intend to do so. And the laws that we'll write in the House, I'm afraid, are not going to survive the Democratic Senate or get Joe Biden's signature. So the situation is going to continue to escalate and continue to worsen. It's already being felt intensely in our major cities and rural communities. New York City taxpayers are paying for luxury accommodations to house this flood of illegal aliens there. Fentanyl trafficked across the southwest border killed 71,000 people in America last year alone. In Tulare County, California, a cartel just viciously executed 6 innocent victims. I believe this country is going to soon awaken to a coordinated terrorist attack by elements that have entered through our porous border or with violent cartel wars erupting on our own streets. Our witnesses today tell the story of what their lives are now like in the border communities. But of course, these illegal aliens don't stay in the border communities. They are being trafficked to every community in America. So I'd like to ask Sheriff Daniels what he believes our communities should expect as this mass illegal migration makes its way from his community to ours.
Thank you, Congressman. Let me start off by saying this. I know we're hitting on immigration and I'm here on border security, but I will say this. You made a comment that they don't stay in our border communities. There is one instance they do stay in our border communities. That's when they die. Over the last 2 years, we have over 1,000 migrants touch U.S. soil coming across our border illegally that have died. That sheriffs, the 31 sheriffs on the border have had to process as homicides until proven otherwise. That's 1,000 migrants under inhumane conditions smuggled by the criminal cartels that we've left in our border communities and left families in Mexico mourning. So there is a consequence to this open border. Second of all, these sheriffs, these police chiefs, these communities are doing the impact. And I've heard it from Democrats, I've heard it from Republicans. I'll say this to you all. I didn't drive out here or come out here 2,000 miles with a political agenda. I came out here with a public safety agenda, and that is to protect all people. Well, you got to do that by starting with border security. That's where it starts. Then we got to look at our immigration laws. And I agree with you, Congressman. We have the laws to address it. Legal. And I'll say that. They can come to any port. I can promise you my 2 international ports in my county, they don't come there. The only time we saw asylum claims on our 2 port of entries was when the cartels were having an internal rift and shot over 40 people. We watched it happen from our international line in my county. We had cartel members claiming credible fear that were allowed in our country, that just executed somebody and then come in and claim credible fear because the other side was trying to kill them. So we have a problem on our border. We truly do, but we need you all's help. You all's help to do it, to fix it. Thank you.
My time's expired. The gentleman from California, Mr. Swalwell.
Mr. Dunn, thank you for coming today. And we all share your love and passion for NOAA and the determination to get something done. And I have a family member, by the grace of God, is alive today after addiction, and also sadly know somebody who has died because of fentanyl. I also believe there's bipartisan support to take on China for its role in exporting fentanyl. And Sheriff Daniels, also thank you for doing a very hard job.
Thank you, Congressman.
2 brothers who are deputy sheriffs, and you've got a very, very tough job, especially just where you are in the world. Would it help your job or hurt your job if you had 20,000 more Border Patrol agents assisting you on the Texas-U.S. border?
Speaking on behalf of Congressman, on behalf of my brothers and sisters from CBP, I would say that would help.
Yeah, I agree. And we passed legislation in the Senate that would have done that. And I wish we could get a vote on that in the House. I also just want to talk to you. My brothers sometimes are a part of raids. You know, it's a car stop. You take guns and drugs out of the car. You put them on a table. You have a press conference. It's a deterrent to future criminals. And you show and hold up the law enforcement who did that. Sometimes they raid houses on search warrants. And again, they find illegal drugs and guns and paraphernalia. Do you consider those types of raids that your department have done, are those successes or failures when that happens?
They're a little bit of both, I'll say, Congressman.
A failure because the drugs are in the community, but a
Yes.
success because you all caught them.
Yes.
The reason I bring that up is because I think too often, many of my colleagues on the other side have rooted on some of the chaos around this issue and don't want to be a part of the solutions or the change. And so recently, there have been a number of tweets that my colleagues have posted. One of them from Mr. Gooden. It says, enough fentanyl to kill 140 million Americans was seized at the southern border in June. In honor of Overdose Awareness Week, I'm calling on Joe Biden to close his open border. Then Mr. Buck said, since November, enough fentanyl to kill 2.1 billion people has been seized at the southern border. We must secure the border and protect our children and families. The chairman of the Republican caucus, Ms. Stefanik, said over 800 pounds of fentanyl were seized at our southern border in October. This is Biden's border crisis. And this is just cheering on chaos instead of honoring the police who did the tough job, the hard work, and seized the drugs and took them off the streets. If we want to talk about some of the fentanyl facts, 96% of the fentanyl seized in the last fiscal year was seized at ports of entry. And 86% of the convictions around fentanyl coming across our border were convictions of US persons. 86%. So we should talk about fentanyl. We should go after China, but this is chaos, what I'm seeing from my Republican colleagues. And when George Bush had successes, rightful successes, stopping the war on terror, I never heard my Republican colleagues say, well, someone was stopped from carrying out a terrorist attack. This is George Bush's terrorism crisis. We should celebrate law enforcement. We should not deride them and use them to make points that actually don't even land, because the fentanyl crisis is not happening where you all are claiming it's happening. So I will take this opportunity, and I'll thank Sheriff Daniels and the men and women he works with, and I'll thank CBP for the hard work they do. And I invite my colleagues to join us, not in chaos, but in change. And finally, Mr. Roy's bill that is a part of this hearing would seek to end asylum, an asylum process that has brought to the United States some of the best minds in science, some of the best athletes in the world, some of the best diplomats like Secretary Madeleine Albright. One person recently said, with respect to Mr. Roy's bill and proposal, are we stupid? Come on, this country was based on good minds. Look at Albert Einstein. We gave him a piece of paper to come in. We are letting the Albert Einstein of this modern time slip away. Wasn't a Democrat who said that. It was Mr. Roy's Republican colleague, Representative Maria Elvira Salazar. So I invite my colleagues, listen to your own colleagues who know better on this issue, because it could use a lot more change and solutions and a lot less chaos. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized. Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Judge Samaniego,
Yes, sir.
did you hear about the conflict between the Mexican army and the Sinaloa cartel in the city of Culiacan in early this month?
I did.
As described in The Guardian, it said that they captured Ovidio Guzman, who's son of El Chapo, prompting a wave of retaliatory attacks from cartel gunmen. After a night of violence, gunmen exchanged fire with security forces, blocking roads with burning vehicles and shooting at army helicopters and police airplanes, bringing reinforcements to the city. According to one resident, heavy fighting raged for hours after Guzman, a key figure in the Sinaloa cartel since the arrest of his father, was arrested in the city early on Thursday. It goes on to say that residents were locked into their homes. All major roads into the city were blocked with burning vehicles, and gunmen attacked a military airbase. It goes on. You would agree that the cartels are dangerous organizations, aren't they?
They are.
And they've come to have extraordinary capacity to operate in Mexico, to the point that they can take on the Mexican army. Isn't that true?
I'm not sure if that's a true statement, but
Well, in this case, they actually had a running battle with the Mexican army where the helicopter gunships were deployed to fire, and they were firing at them. There was an open warfare in the city. You do understand that, right, sir?
I do understand that.
Do you not see it as possible that in a future with an uncontrolled border, a border we can't control, that those same conditions could exist on the streets of American cities?
I believe that's not the case because I think we're mixing two things. We're mixing one, and that's unrest. We have unrest ourselves here in the United States, just like in Mexico, and we're mixing two things.
Are the cartels strengthened by the fees they receive for trafficking humans across the border?
Well, you know, I think there's a lot of assumptions. in
Is that a hard
situation.
question to answer, yes or no?
Well, give me the question straight so I can understand what you
My
said.
understanding is that billions in income come to the cartels, and according to the Border Patrol officers I've met, they say nobody comes across the Rio Grande. Nobody comes across the border without paying a fee of thousands. And many of these people don't have thousands, so they enter a life of indentured servitude until they pay it off. Their family might be tortured to pay for it. And the cartels earn billions from it. Is that not true? In your knowledge?
It's true, but it's true on the Trump era as well.
Okay.
It's not, it has nothing to do
I don't even
with
think it's
today.
necessarily should be a battle between Republicans and Democrats about who gets kudos for stopping the flood across the border. But isn't it true that the policy is strengthening the cartels, these dangerous cartels that can operate in the open and conduct open warfare with the Mexican army?
Well, I think you're talking about the root cause, and that's a broken system. And we're having, you know, we have to shoulder a broken system there in our community.
So it's just, we just deplore it as a broken system. But we don't need to respond as if this is an emergency and a threat to the United States, that the same conditions could occur here.
I'm not understanding how you're mixing the two things of trying to help asylum seekers. It's part of our.
Well, if
our
this
policy.
transnational criminal cartel organizations that exist, and they're capable of doing what they're doing in Mexico, and they're being strengthened day in and day out, and their drug trade is producing profits and expanding their forces in the United States, isn't it just a matter of time and amount before they can do the same thing here that they do there?
We've seen this for 50, 60 years, cartels doing that and the fights that happen between them. We live that, and we happen to be one of the safest when Mexico was the worst in the world in violence. We were still the safest community in the country.
So you're copacetic about it. You think there's not a threat to the United States?
Well, there's a threat, but I cannot understand what we're here for immigration. We're here to discuss what's the right thing to do for immigration. And I've always said that when you mix the two, it gets very complicated. It's complicated enough to look at them separately, much less when you combine the two. When you try to talk about the drugs and try to talk about immigration, it gets so mixed up that you can resolve it. So I'd like to really focus on the fact that we need to do the best thing that we can. You know, you're very.
I'm out of time. I'd let you go on. I question your conclusion about what's humane and what's not, and with that, I yield back.
Well, thank you, sir.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Liu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me start off by noting that the chairman of this full Judiciary Committee lawfully defied a bipartisan congressional subpoena. Now, Mr. Dunn, thank you for coming here today. Sorry for your loss, and thank you for sharing your story and your efforts on working on the fentanyl issue. Judge Salmon, where you go. I have some questions for you about fentanyl. I agree with my Republican and Democratic colleagues that we need to tackle this issue. It's your experience, isn't it, that the overwhelming majority of fentanyl seizures occur at ports of entry and not from migrants bringing them across the border. Is that right?
That's correct. That's what we understand. That's what we know. We work so close with law enforcement, Border Patrol, ICE, and we do not get that suggestion that it's the migrants. And we talk directly to them. It's not the migrants that have that issue. It's at the port of entry by Americans, by the way, that are crossing into the United States more so than any other form that comes through our borders.
And in fact, your experience is actually what the data shows. So I have an article here from the Cato Institute, which is a libertarian think tank. The title of it is fentanyl is smuggled for U.S. citizens by U.S. citizens. And what the facts from this article show are that in 2021, U.S. citizens were 86.3% of the convicted fentanyl traffickers. In addition, over 90% of fentanyl seizures occur at legal crossing points or interior vehicle checkpoints. So if we really want to tackle the bulk of this issue, what we want to do is strengthen technology at legal points of entry, at the ports of entry. We want to give Border Patrol more resources at these ports of entry to address the fentanyl seizures. And thank you to all the Border Patrol agents that the Republicans have highlighted repeatedly for how much they've been seizing in fentanyl because they're doing their job. And I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter this article from the Cato Institute titled, "Fentanyl is smuggled for U.S. citizens by U.S. citizens, not by asylum seekers."
Without objection.
So Sheriff Daniels, thank you for your public service.
Thank you, Congressman.
Do you know which American president said, for decades, the United States has not been in complete control of its borders?
No.
That president was George W. Bush in 2006. Are you familiar with Operation Intercept at all?
I'm not.
Okay. That was an operation put in by an American president that basically shut down the southern border for about 3 weeks. And then it was lifted because it was not sustainable. That American president was Richard Nixon. This hearing is titled Biden's Border Crisis. That is completely wrong. It is a crisis for over half a century, from Nixon and every American president after him. They have not addressed this issue. I'm going to read you some comments from various American presidents. 80 to 90% of the heroin that comes into the U.S. today comes across our southern border. You know who said that? President Ford said that. Millions of undocumented aliens have illegally immigrated to the U.S. They have breached our nation's immigration laws, displaced many American citizens from jobs, and placed increased financial burden on many states and local governments. President Carter said that. The ongoing migration of persons to the United States in violation of our laws is a serious national problem. President Reagan said that. I was especially concerned about the growing problems of alien smuggling and international terrorists hiding behind immigrant status. President Clinton said that. I could go on and on. The only folks that can actually fix this problem is the United States Congress by passing laws. And we had the chance to do that with a bipartisan comprehensive immigration reform bill that passed the U.S. Senate on a bipartisan basis. And guess who stopped it? House Republicans. So it is simply a false narrative that this is Biden's border crisis. It is a crisis of over half a century, and the people that can stop it are we in Congress. I urge Republicans, instead of doing hearings and doing talking points, to actually work with Democrats on a comprehensive immigration bill that will, in fact, solve this problem. And with that, I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy.
I thank the chairman, Mr. Daniels, with respect to that previous point. There's been about 4.7 million apprehensions under the current administration. Is that unprecedented in your eyes?
Yes.
2.7 million people have been released into the United States. Is that unprecedented? In fact, way off the charts compared to past numbers?
Yes.
The extent to which fentanyl is pouring into our communities, is that precedented?
Yes.
Or is it precedented? It's unprecedented, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
I
I would ask the Judge Samaniego, you testified that there's no invasion. There were 162,000 encounters in the El Paso sector alone in the first quarter of this fiscal year. Does that sound correct? According to Border Patrol numbers. 55,000 in December alone. Is that correct? We had the Democrat mayor of El Paso who has been busing people to New York City. Truth?
Nope.
The Democrat mayor of El Paso has not been putting people on buses, sending them to New York City.
Not without notification at the other end.
Okay, but they're putting them on buses and sending them to New York City. And New York City today is asking the federal government for money to process individuals that they're dealing with overflowing in New York City. Now, you testified earlier that you weren't getting help from the state of Texas. Now, the city of El Paso declared emergency, but has the county declared emergency?
No,
No, the county has not declared emergency.
no, we did not.
The earlier testimony that you had before, you testified that this effort to want to secure the border is racist. So here's a question for you. 50% of Border Patrol are Hispanic. Border Patrol overwhelmingly wants us to change policies to secure the border. Not just as some are testifying that we need more resources. I know that Mr. Daniels, Sheriff Daniels, testified that having 20,000 additional agents would be helpful. The answer to that is, of course. Of course, having more personnel would be helpful. But the question is what do they most want? Mr. Daniels, what does Border Patrol most want to secure the border? Do they want policy changes to actually enforce the law, or do they want more resources? Which would they rank higher?
Policy changes,
What kind of policy changes? Enforcing the laws of the United States at the border?
enforce the rule of law, and I'll share this add-on too, support from, they feel like they're not being supported by this administration.
If we had a law that said that we should follow current law to detain individuals claiming asylum for the pendency of the adjudication of that claim, to require that they be detained according to current law, would that be banning asylum?
No,
And if people are claiming in this committee that it is banning asylum, would that be untrue?
yes,
Hector Garza works in Laredo, Texas for Border Patrol. He's a friend. He is Hispanic. He said, the mother of all caravans isn't just materializing out of the ether. It's just the most recent wave of an invasion that is being aided and abetted by liberal activists who believe that subverting United States law is the best way to achieve their radical policy objectives. Mr. Daniels, do you believe that Hispanic Border Patrol agent Hector Garza is racist by describing what we're experiencing at the border as an invasion and suggesting that it is in fact the policies of liberal activists represented by my Democratic colleagues in this committee and in this House, that is what is subverting United States law? Do you believe that is racist?
no,
Judge Samaniego, do you believe that there, in light of your statement saying that these policies that are being promoted to secure the border, that you think that Border Patrol agent Hector Garza, a lifelong public servant working for the Border Patrol in Laredo, Texas, an Hispanic, a Texan, it's racist for that Hispanic American to say that it is an invasion, that his Border Patrol personnel are overwhelmed, that he believes that it is the liberal policies that are making a mockery of our current laws to say that we should enforce the laws, that we should enforce the laws on the books, that is in fact a racist statement by Hispanic Border Patrol agent Hector Garza?
Well, it's a freedom of speech and he can say whatever he needs to say. I can tell you that if you ask the Border Patrol in El Paso, they're looking for assistance, that we do not detain them because they don't have the space, they don't have the personnel.
I appreciate that, but I would just suggest to you is that that is not a racist statement to say that we should think we should secure the border. This chart, Mr. Daniels, can you see it from there? Can you see the uptick in the numbers here, way up here?
yes,
That chart reflects the uptick in migrant deaths. That's 2020 to 2022. Almost 1,000 migrant deaths at the southwest border of the United States. We had 53 migrants die in a tractor trailer in San Antonio, cooked in the Texas heat. 57 were killed when a tractor trailer crammed with migrants rolled over the highway, crashing in Mexico's southern state of Chiapas. Ask me this, is it Christian for migrants to be treated like that and to die in tractor trailers? Would anybody at this panel think it's Christian? Mr. Dunn, you go to church in Hays County. Is it Christian to allow migrants to die like that?
No.
Time has expired.
Is not.
Thank you, Mr. Dunn.
Thank you. Before I call on you, I have a few articles that I want to read into the record. El Paso forced to bus immigrants out of town amid mass migration from the New York Post. El Paso joins Governor Greg Abbott in busing migrants to New York City from Texas Tribune. And El Paso looks like a third world country after Texas border city for the New York Post. Without objection, recognize the gentlelady.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank the witnesses, all of you, for being here. Mr. Dunn, I want to join my colleagues in expressing my condolences to you and your wife, Janelle, and your family for your profound loss of Noah. For 4 years, Donald Trump pursued some of the most inhumane immigration policies as president. He cruelly tore thousands of children from their parents and did everything in his power to dismantle any parts of the U.S. legal immigration system and refugee resettlement system, a system that has been called the crown jewel of American humanitarianism, not by liberal radicals, but actually by the Association of Evangelicals. Today, my colleagues across the aisle want to go even further than Donald Trump, with policies that would effectively end asylum and place unaccompanied children in Remain in Mexico type proceedings. Not even Donald Trump went that far. But don't take my word for how extreme this is. Even other Republicans have said that these proposals go too far, calling them extreme, and again, not liberal radicals calling them extreme, or calling them anti-American. That was from another Republican, other Republicans in this Congress. In fact, one Texas Republican said, and I quote, "Border security and immigration are two separate topics. One can be for a strong border security presence that prevents terrorists, fentanyls, and bad actors from entering our country, and one can be for welcoming future Americans in through the front door." So here are some facts. Since Congress created the Department of Homeland Security in 2003, we have spent over $350 billion on the agencies that enforce immigration law. Federal immigration spending has surpassed what was promised in multiple immigration bills that would have reformed the actual system so that there are legal pathways for people to come to this country. But we know that throwing money at the border without also fixing the legal immigration system is not going to be successful. We have passed, in December of 2022, Democrats passed the fiscal year 2023 omnibus, which included $60 million to hire additional CBP officers and support personnel at ports of entry, and another $70 million to strengthen non-intrusive inspection systems that scan vehicles and cargo to disrupt the flow of drugs, including fentanyl, at ports of entry. Not one of my Republican colleagues voted for that legislation. In June of 2020, Congress passed the infrastructure bill, which included $430 million to modernize our ports of entry and improve CBP's ability to detect illicit drugs. 200 House Republicans voted against it. We put that money in because we know that over 90% of fentanyl is seized at ports of entry. Now, I understand that the issues that we are talking about today require my Republican colleagues to tell a lot of statements that aren't true, to use nativist rhetoric, words like invasion and flooding that have actually been used throughout the history of this country to demonize immigrants to this country, different waves of immigrants that have come into this country. But that is not the way that we are going to solve this problem. Judge Samaniego, I want to thank you for your service and also for sending us the wonderful Congresswoman Escobar, who is such an important voice here on this committee and in this Congress. I want to call your attention to this chart that shows that when the Biden administration rolled out a clear process for Haitians to seek admission into the United States in June through August of 2021, and then again beginning in April of 2022, the number of Haitians presenting themselves at ports of entry increased. In fact, as we maintained that clear legal process for Haitians, people coming outside of the process basically ended. In your experience, meeting with people seeking safety, do you hear a persistent desire to follow a legal process to enter the United States?
Absolutely. I've seen some incredible situations where they're waiting in Juarez under very difficult circumstances. And sometimes the only reason they cross is because it gets so difficult for them. So they really are interested in doing the right thing. And I'm glad you mentioned the separation of children. There's nothing more heartbreaking. And I want to give credit to our Congresswoman who's really stepped up. So sometimes it doesn't take a law, it just takes a person in El Paso and everywhere else. No longer is a separation of children because she found it to be offensive. She stood up for it, she's championed for that, and we no longer do that. And I think that's quite an accomplishment.
Thank you. My time is yielded. I do ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, to enter the following statements into the record. The American Immigration Lawyers Association, Church World Services, Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights, First Focus Campaign for Children, Human Rights First, Kids in Need of Defense, National Immigration Law Center, National Immigration Project, Project on Government Oversight and the Southern Border Communities Coalition.
Without objection. I recognize the gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Sparts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Judge Samaniego, do you believe in the rule of law?
Pardon me?
Do you believe in the rule of law?
Absolutely.
So let me ask you a question. You were talking about asylum seekers. How many of them are actually legitimate asylum seekers, cases percentage-wise, based on the current law?
I think that's an impossible question because they have the right to say that they have credible fear. And it's not my position or my role to determine whether that's true or not, but that's the court.
But the cases, when you go and look at these cases, what is the percentage of them actually legitimate? What do you assess? That is actually was not abuse?
From the stories I've heard and what they go through and how they're persecuted in their countries and how, you know, how they're treated. And it's not economically driven as much as it's fear driven.
So what is the percentages actually that could be legitimate? No, when I was in Texas, a few years ago, and I talked to some people there, I actually been in El Paso too, it was under 10%. I'm not sure if this number changed now, but would you say that majority of them are not?
Well, I mean, you're asking for a non-objective. I mean, I can't.
Okay,
tell
then
you
let
that.
me question. If there are a lot of illegitimate cases, do you think it hurts legitimate asylum seeker that actually can be killed by their government?
Well, absolutely. I mean, they're seeking to get away from their difficult situation, but I cannot tell you. That's up to the
So
court. to
do you
determine.
believe that, and I agree with you that it shouldn't be where the court really should be doing it because we're delaying the process, and do you believe that have such a large number of people at the border doesn't allow us actually to help legitimate people that could be dead? Because we have some people that very desperate people, don't get me wrong, life is tough in a lot of countries. There are a lot of things, that is real bad, but we have people really in a life and death situation. Do you believe to have such a scale of people coming to the border and maybe abusing the system and cartel take advantage of some of these people actually hurts legitimate people?
Well, that's the broken system. I mean, we're asking, the system says you have the right to express credible fear.
But the system should be checked at the border and should be go in the first port of entry. So there is a lot of abuses of the system. Do you believe we then need to tighten a little bit asylum procedures from our standpoint, that Border Patrol can do a better job, that we don't have to wait for a lot of cases that when they get to the court system? Do you think it's illegitimate?
I can tell you that the number of times that a migrant is vetted is unbelievable.
But they're not vetting for credible fear right now because they're so overwhelmed that they just say, I have a credible fear. Cartel gives you a piece of paper, say what you say the right thing to do, and they just let you go. And hopefully they give notice to appear. Some of them don't even give them anymore because they cannot process it. It's becoming a situation where it's becoming, no one can handle this amount. So do you believe we need to improve that from your perspective, that it's not enforcement issue, that enforcement law needs to be tightened? Is that?
Absolutely, it needs to be improved, but I think you're not giving us a solution. It's not an easy solution for us to determine whether it is or it isn't credible fear, because the law says that if you express it, then we have to accept
Well,
it.
at least we agree something the law maybe need to be tightened because we're really hurting the people. Do you believe that cartels making so much money on desperate poor people that the message spread, they all come to the country, is really hurts legal immigration, but also it's really creating modern day slavery because these are desperate people. Do you believe that would be characterized like that?
Well, what I've said over and over again is that if you stop the process, you help the cartels. When the process is moving, it's very difficult for them to do the things that they do. When you push them back
Do
to
you
what
don't
is.
think all this money actually are helping them to empower them and control now almost the whole border with a lot of money, have better resources than our Border Patrol has? You don't believe it helping them because all of these people pay them a lot of money, and from desperate countries, they don't make enough money to pay unless they become enslaved by these people.
I agree, but every time that the process stops, that's when they get abused, they get raped, and so there's people that legitimately can come into our country if we can help them process and get them quickly moving. less likely with a cartel.
And I think we need to work on that. Maybe we can at least find common ground on that. And what would you say, Sheriff, from your experience, what really need to be done? And we have like a few seconds left to really find common ground to stop this insanity.
I'll talk fast. I actually spoke with Secretary Mayorkas about putting judicial oversight at the southern border so they can address these asylum claims, these credible fear claims. As we know, the high percentage don't qualify under law to do that. Secretary Mayorkas stated, I 100%, that's a quote, I 100% agree with you, Sheriff, but we've seen no action over last year to get that done because we could address it at the border, not within our communities.
Thank you. My time has expired. Thank you.
I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Correa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, Mr. Dunn, I also want to convey my condolences at your loss of your son, Noah. I'm a father of 4, and every day I pray for my children. I'm also a Little League dad, and I've seen young children go from promising athletes to drug rehab. Terrible situation. Drug abuse, the scourge in our society, does not discriminate. Working hard to make sure nobody falls victim to the scourge. And Sheriff Daniels, I also want to thank you for your good work.
Thank you, sir.
I have a brother that served the LAPD for 30 years.
Thank you for your service.
He's got some interesting stories.
Yeah, I bet you do.
You mentioned human trafficking. You mentioned $3,000. Is that the price to smuggle a human being to this country?
No, it's 7,000 and up to be smuggled by the criminal cartels. For the drivers that are coming to my county, going to 3 hours north to Phoenix, Maricopa County, it's $3,000 per person.
I just got back from Central America, and the going price now is about $22,000. And most of the women, 80% of the women, by the time they get to El Paso, to our southern border, are either raped or sexually abused.
Yes.
And I would say that that's a lot of desperation, putting yourself at risk. A woman preparing herself for that eventuality and paying $22,000.
I would agree.
You know, like many of us here, I've had the opportunity to go to the southern border, El Paso, San Isidro, Canadian border as well. My job in Homeland Security. Only have 3 minutes left, so I'm going to talk about the San Isidro border crossing. When I usually cross that border, come back to the U.S., I identify myself to the border agents, tell them who I am, ask them how's the day work going, and usually get average answers. One day, agent told me, look behind you. See all those cars? I said, yes. He says, they are essentially filled with Russian and Ukrainian undocumented immigrants. I said, it's new? They said, no, it's been happening for a few months now. Well, the Russian-Ukrainian war started. Those undocumented Ukrainians are now Ukrainian refugees. April of 2022, less than a year ago, I went back to San Isidro, actually to Tijuana, Mexico, to visit a refugee camp of Ukrainians. This is what I found behind me. The Mexican government took a baseball field, turned it into a refugee camp. The Mexican police were guarding that camp to make sure those refugees were safe. American private and public donations poured in. Doctors, nurses, healthcare professionals came in from across the country to make sure healthcare needs were taken care of. This became a processing center for Ukrainian refugee camps. Refugees would come in 24 to 48 hours. They would board a bus, be driven to the pedestrian West Crossing. Title 42 would be waived. They would get a parole status and walk across the border. This is an example of how you deal with the refugee crisis right here, ladies and gentlemen. This doesn't look like El Paso. This is the way you address the refugee challenge. The Biden administration, thankfully, is now working on implementing a similar program, parole program for Cubans, Haitians, and Nicaraguans. But we still have the Afghanis that fought alongside our troops that are still hanging out there somewhere. Same thing for Syrians. And Sheriff Daniels, I ask you those questions because it's an issue of incentives, folks. Very, very desperate individuals You got to give them a reason to go through the legal process because they are desperate. And the refugee challenge is not just the United States. It's a worldwide issue. And the solution isn't just here. Our neighbors, Canada and Mexico, have to be part of the solution as well. Under existing laws, this is the way you do it. I'm out of time. Chairman, I yield. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for being here. Mr. Dunn, our prayers are with you and your family for the loss of your son. This hearing is designed to bring to Washington the concerns of the people at the border about this border crisis and seek out its origins, which are clearly down at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue in the White House. From day one, this administration has blatantly ignored U.S. immigration laws and policies designed to keep America safe. And after several visits to the border myself, it's clear we need border enforcement now. The open border and amnesty policies have made this crisis worse every single day. It encourages more vulnerable populations to make what is a very dangerous journey. Americans should be outraged by the Biden administration's failed leadership. On January 30th, KFOX 14 in El Paso reported on Border Patrol reports in the article entitled Unprecedented Number of Migrants Reported in El Paso in the First Quarter of 2023. More than 64% of the migrants encountered during this timeframe were single adults, some attempting to evade arrest and not seeking asylum. Unaccompanied children encounters increased by 59% in the last fiscal year of 2022, the same time frame, as opposed to 8,000 unaccompanied children encounters. El Paso sector recorded only 5,000, so that's up. The sector led the nation in the first quarter of the fiscal year with total migrant encounters across all 20 U.S. Border Patrol sectors. Agents apprehended 37 individuals with criminal records, rescued 61 migrants, including tender-aged children, some abandoned in the remote desert, and intercepted 22 narcotics loads. A defense attorney in El Paso, a juvenile defense attorney, stated youth are getting more involved with crime, huge increases in weapons, and he thinks it's just because they're getting money to pay for these weapons, and how they're earning that money is from drugs. I see a lot of kids are helping the human smuggling, and that's a big problem. Although, Judge, you stated in your testimony there's no invasion of migrants in our community, nor are there hordes of undocumented immigrants. Crimes against citizens are causing havoc in our community. When you see an increase in children helping human smuggling, how is that not the case? How is it not the case that these policies are contributing to the delinquency of minors in your area?
And once again, I don't see the correlation of things that are going wrong with our country and sort of saying that it's influenced by our immigration or people coming through. Like I said, we don't see that. We try our best to deal with the circumstances at hand, and then we try our best to move people along. And I've said over and over, you guys have the luxury of being Democrats and Republicans. We have to be public servants, and that's all we can do. When they come across, we do not manage who comes across. We manage how to process them in the most possible, the best possible way. And I've said over and over, El Paso really thinks as a nation. I think people think that we just focus on our situation there at the community, but we don't. That we're really concerned about having New York having to deal with that, having Chicago deal with that. We've talked to each one of the mayors, and we're working. I think if we were to put in more of a national system of allowing communities to say who needs the migrants and then helping us to process them there, and I use the Houston model, is just exceptional. Every single day, 52 come in, they go back to Houston, they go to the bigger hubs, and we move them through. And so that's where we need your help. We need your help, not to whether or not what we're doing is right or inaccurate, but the fact that it's a community that really shoulders a tremendous amount of a broken system.
Well, and you say that the transportation of these individuals to other cities is necessary to prevent your community from descent into chaos, correct?
No, that's not
So
true.
you're fine keeping them all in your jurisdiction instead
You
of
know,
sending them to other
we
locations?
would welcome them, but it's a shame that that they're concerned about being close to the border because of how they're going to be treated and how they're going to be deported, even if they shouldn't be deported. So you've got migrants wanting to move into the interiors simply because they don't feel safe, even if they're here processed and legal. Once they're processed, they're legal in our community. And so, once again, I think we're helping the nation do the right thing.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes the gentlelady, Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our colleagues on the other side of the aisle seem to have called this hearing to really promote fear-mongering or disinformation in order to justify a radical plan that would effectively shut down asylum to everyone. And the plan is so extreme that their Republican colleagues have objected that it's ineffective, inhumane, and even un-American. And what I find particularly pernicious is the attempt to conflate the issues of migrants seeking legal asylum through our legal processes with the very real scourge of fentanyl trafficking, which, as CBP data demonstrates and Judge Samaniego has testified, overwhelmingly comes through the ports of entry in trucks and cargo ships, not on the backs of migrants trying to flee poverty or violence in their home countries. By falsely suggesting that migrant families seeking asylum are the source of the fentanyl epidemic, we can't even start to craft policy measures that could actually address either of these issues, the fentanyl crisis or the humanitarian issues raised by the push factors in South and Central America and our immigration laws. So I don't want to waste this opportunity. And since most of my experience before coming to Congress has to do with how badly broken our immigration laws are, I just wanted to focus there. How do we handle the increase in asylum seekers at the southern border with real fixes like some of those that Judge Samaniego has suggested? As I suggested, we do need to address the root causes of migration, but we need to have functioning pathways here in this country that people can pursue. I mean, I've represented enough folks seeking asylum to know that there aren't functional pathways. I think we heard a statistic that only a small percentage of people seeking asylum are actually entitled to it. That's not true. The statistics vary very widely across the country, but in some areas, particularly on the border where there are less friendly judges often, the rates are very, very different than in other areas across the country. So Judge Samaniego, you are not an immigration judge, are you? You don't adjudicate asylum claims.
We do not.
Okay, I did want to clarify that. Now, a couple years ago, I had the opportunity to visit the border and speak with Customs and Border Patrol, Homeland Security agents, and advocates, and did see that there is a humane processing process available there. And I really appreciate that. Why do you think that's been so successful over the years, particularly when compared with other cities and counties along the border?
I think one is that we've accepted to be humanitarian, and when you do not start at that point, then you don't create processes, you don't create ways to handle them. The NGOs are not working with you, the Border Patrol doesn't work with you. So I think the moment that you make that determination that you're going to be humanitarian, it forces you to come up with systems to help out. And there are some, for example, there's things that we could do. The Venezuelan population dropped tremendously as soon as the Border Patrol has an app that you can now, from your country, you can begin to apply. And we're talking about vetting the credible fear. So you're able to do a little bit of that, and the numbers drop tremendously. I think also I was able to talk to the ambassador from the U.S. to Mexico, and he talked about what do we do at the origin. The point of origin is very important because we know that, for example, why is Colombia not treating Venezuelans properly, and then Venezuelans have to leave their country to come to our country? And so it's not just a pull that we have a push that we need to look at as well. And so, I think if we get creative, but I think once you start with the idea that you have to, it's safety, We have to make sure that the economy is taken care of. El Paso was one of the strongest economies in all of Texas. We were one of the strongest. And so while we're dealing with the situation, we have to worry about the economy. So the economy, the safety, and being able to do the right things from a humanitarian. I think if you start from that premise, I think things are more solvable. If you start from the premise that you don't want them here, then what's the solution?
And I do want to pick up on that because over the past few months, Texas's governor has sent dozens of busloads of vulnerable migrants to Philadelphia, which I represent, without notice or coordination, which of course has made it more difficult for our willing city authorities to welcome those folks. But when you have 2 buses dumped on New Year's Eve morning before 6 o'clock and you have vulnerable people without coats, it's very difficult. So I appreciate your insight that cooperation can smooth over many of the issues that we're dealing with. I see my time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman.
I recognize the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany.
Judge Samaniego, you said in one of your answers earlier that people come here because they're passionate and you've advocated for allowing people to come in here. Do you think that's a reason why we should allow people into America on a legal basis because they're passionate to come to America?
Well, no. I said they were here for different reasons. They just happen to be passionate as an additional component. I mean, they come because they're fearing what's happening in their community. I've talked to, like I said earlier, when they tell you that every day their mom or their dad calls them and says they come here looking for you every morning and they want to know where you're at. That's why they're moving in this direction.
Thank you. I'm really glad this issue in regards to Governor Abbott moving people to various cities around the country has come up. Have you been critical of Governor Abbott for what he's done?
Absolutely, absolutely. Because when you send someone that's not organized and they don't know who's on that bus, and some of them are not sponsored, that's a huge burden on that community.
Have you been critical of the Biden administration when they've flown people all over the country in the dark of night?
I don't know of that taking place. I apologize.
So you have not seen, for example, I have an article here entitled "Biden Administration Quietly Flies Illegal Immigrants to New York in Middle of Night," and we just heard from a fellow member on this panel saying they're doing it in Philadelphia also. Do you think that's right for the Biden administration to do that?
Well, I think it's an indication of that they have to decompress because when we get flights that are going out, it's to decompress the system there with the Border Patrol and has nothing to do with their community.
So did you give the benefit of the doubt to Governor Abbott and say, well, maybe they're decompressing these people on their trips to these cities?
Well,
I mean, isn't it the same thing, Judge Samaniego?
No, it isn't because it's not coordinated. We've never gotten a call from the governor to tell us, hey, what do you need? How can we help? How can we do things?
No,
and we just get buses.
I
to
really
leave.
appreciate that. Biden administration quietly flies illegal immigrants to New York in the middle of the night. That's what they're doing. We'll be happy to share this article with you so you can see what's happening there. Thank you for your answer. Sheriff Daniels, I was in your county in June of 2020. What's changed since June of 2020?
Well, we went from, just to put it in perspective, around 5% of my jail population was border related up to almost 45% now, 45%. We've seen the pursuits. Last year, we put 180 people in jail for pursuits that were deadly pursuits. When I say deadly, driving at 100 miles an hour plus, endangering communities. Some resulted in deaths. Some we interdicted before they killed somebody. We see the flow of public safety challenges in our community based on this border every day. So it's changed drastically as a result of this border.
Because what I heard from you sheriffs is that there was good coordination all the way from the local level, all the way up to the federal government, June of 2020. And that there was some control the border was becoming more secure. Is that generally an accurate statement?
Yes, Congressman. In fact, Border Patrol, when I pull up to the scene to help my deputies, the troopers, officers, or agents, they always make a point to come over and say, Sheriff, thank you for what you do. Thanks for being a voice for us.
We heard earlier that, I can't remember who it was that said that increased fentanyl is not tied to illegal border crossings. Do you agree with that statement?
No.
And why not?
The criminal cartels are exploiting our border, whether they're trafficking children, adults, males, females, whether they're human smuggling for profit, or they're doing illicit drugs. Either way, the criminal cartels are exploiting a border, and I keep hearing the word, different words about how it's controlled. It's not effectively managed right now, and until it is, the cartels are they're the winners of this.
Those of you on the other side of the aisle, you can continue to wear blinders, or you can do photo op trips like the president did down to El Paso, where they clean up that region before he comes in. You can do that. But the American people are seeing very clearly what's going on. And now that we're in the majority, we're going to try to identify this as much as possible, because you're hearing the truth here from people like the sheriff, from the fentanyl families. And I hope you're meeting with those fentanyl families, because it's directly tied to the border. I want to just close with this. I hope as we go through this process, we also get more information out in regards to the NGOs, the International Organization for Migration, which has weaponized immigration into this country all the way from Panama up to the southern border. I hope we dig in deep to those NGOs that are complicit in the greatest human trafficking operation perhaps in the history of the world. I yield back.
Chair recognizes gentlelady from Pennsylvania. Is that right, Ms. Dean?
Yes.
Okay, Ms. Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all our testifiers for being here today. We benefit from your experience and your service and your knowledge and your heartbreaking family experience. You know, before I ran for Congress, I was a professor. For 10 years, I taught at LaSalle University in Philadelphia, teaching writing and rhetoric and ethics. And that's why I can't help noticing the words so often used by my Republican colleagues when we're talking about both of these tragic issues. Words like hordes, invasion, crisis, open border. It's purposeful. They want the American people to be scared. They want us to feel threatened. They want to create divisions because othering people makes it far easier to mistreat them. The reality is there is no invasion. There are no hordes of invaders. Our borders are not being overrun by dangerous criminals. But we do have a broken immigration system. At the same time, we are suffering with an extraordinary, deadly drug problem in our country. Mr. Dunn and Mrs. Dunn, Ms. Janelle, my extraordinary heartfelt sympathy to you on the loss of dear Noah, poisoned by fentanyl, as you have written here in your testimony. My family knows a little bit about drugs and poisoning, but from a different perspective, my son is a recovering addict. And it is by the grace of God that he did not run into the deadly fentanyl that would have taken his life. But we must be able to talk about these things honestly and not conflate them, as my colleague just said. There's a difference between the facts and the rhetoric, between wanting to solve these problems or just trying to make people afraid of them. The fact is, 90% of fentanyl, heroin, and meth seized in this country is captured at ports of entries. Just about everybody who has spoken to has said this. This means that drugs are being brought in through normal channels, not on the backs of families crossing at remote parts of the country. The vast majority I'm talking about. I'm sure it's not 100%. In fact, CBP reports that drug cartels are now recruiting Americans to bring fentanyl into this country, not undocumented immigrants. And we have a horrific problem. Like your dear Noah, we are losing more than 100,000 people a year to overdose. More than 70% of those fentanyl. I wear this band for the son, a 24-year-old son who died of an overdose, fentanyl poisoning. And sadly, it's not one anymore. This band now represents at least a half a dozen in my community whose children have lost their lives. But let's get serious about it. Let's stop demonizing the immigrant who comes and asks for help. Judge Samaniego, I understand, and I have been to El Paso, to the port of entry. It's the second busiest border crossing in the United States. You interact with a large number of these people who are, and they're people seeking safety and humane treatment. Can you tell us just a couple snippets of why they are coming across?
And I said earlier, a large number that you hear is that they were in their country, they were abused, they try to defend themselves, and they get targeted. That's one big category where they're just trying to do the right thing in their own country, but their own country rejects them, and then they target them. That's a big part of it. And a lot of it, like I said, is just, it's not, the economy plays a second part of it. Obviously, the economy is worse, and that's not a reason to come to our country because of the economy. But they're really driven by the fact that they can no longer live in their communities.
And we know that we've seen these numbers for a large number of years, not just under the Biden administration. I think in your testimony, you wrote at least the last 4 years, you've had increased numbers.
Absolutely.
Can you speak to what you also said in your testimony, which is this, what I'm so concerned about, which is the false racist narrative that is being promoted here today and is promoted day after day here in Congress?
Well, if anybody's concerned with that, it's us. I mean, we that narrative was picked up by a shooter that, at the Walmart situation. And we hear that, and it concerns us as a community when you say racism and invasion and all of these things. It makes our community extremely nervous because then we might get targeted for being that community and for being humanitarian. And so I do ask for this words to be settled in a different way. You don't need to say invasion and all of these things that are happening across the border. We're a community that works really hard. We're very privileged with what we have, and it's just very concerning when we hear this because we don't know if we're going to be targeted because of these comments.
And I know my time is up. I thank all three of you for your service. And Mr. Dunn, I thank you for your wish to educate people about the extraordinary dangers to our children.
The gentlelady's
Thank you.
time's expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Van Drew.
Thank you, Chairman. First of all, Mr. Dunn, as everybody else has said, and I know we've been repetitive, but it really is heartfelt. We feel for you as somebody who, I'm a grandfather, I am getting older, and a father, and I can't imagine. I cannot imagine, and I will tell you, and I mean this sincerely, that I will pray for you and for your family. I don't know, sometimes I think the world's upside down, and the more that time goes on, especially recently, it seems upside down to me. So I have to talk about a few of the things that I heard my colleagues on the other side say, that, for example, this hearing was a show. The hearing's not a show. In order to determine how to effectively fix something, you have to study it, you have to learn about it, and you have to hear about it. And that's what this hearing's about. It's not a show, and it's also not anti-immigration. None of these Republicans, and I'm sure none of the Democrats, are anti-immigration, but we are anti-illegal immigration. There is a difference. There is the rule of law. I don't know where we've lost that, and that's what I mean by the world being upside down. The rule of law, that you follow laws and things happen in a certain way. And the other secret here that people sometimes don't want to talk about is no country that's ultimately successful for a long period of time has wide open borders. Yes, there can be border problems. America's had border problems. Many countries have had border problems. But nevertheless, you can't say that you can just have completely open borders. If that's true, let's just open our country completely to every single country in the world and say we have no borders, and as many people want to come here can come here, whether they're sick or not, whether they have other issues or not, whether drugs are coming in or not. And yes, drugs are coming in because the cartels are helping these people to get across and using them. And human trafficking is happening, and human abuse is happening. I'm sorry, Judge, but it is. And if you talk to people down there, I know the people you talk to don't see it and hear it, but the people that I do, and we're going to go again real soon, do see it and hear it. It's true. It's real. I kind of empathized with the Sheriff Daniels, when you spoke about Secretary Mayorkas, because I've had the opportunity to ask him questions a number of times when I was on the Homeland Security Committee, and the guy doesn't tell the truth. No, nobody wants to say it openly, but I will. The guy's a liar. He does not tell the truth. And when he tells you he's going to look at something, he doesn't. When he tells you he's going to do something, he doesn't. When you show him a video of terrible things happening, once it was a video of a young officer actually saving somebody's life that was drowning, and they found out that it was a drug dealer whose life he saved. By the way, the officer died. That's the truth. The truth is we have a problem. And the truth is that we need borders that are effective and we need borders that are sealed. And the truth is, it is Biden's. I'll be the partisan one here. It is Biden's problem because in 2 years, it's radically changed. When President Trump put together a strong array of immigration policies at stemming the flow of illegal immigrant crossings, there was so much of a reduction. It was so much safer. It was getting better. It was working. And you know what? Legal immigrants don't like the illegal immigration. They don't want to be mixed into that. In his very first day in office, President Biden decimated this process. He ignored the experts. He ignored the expert advice of those serving at the borders. He turned his back on the millions of Americans that live in border communities. Does anybody care about all these people that are being overrun? Well, we're all going to care soon because we're all going to be overrun. And that's not hyperbole. It's not extreme. They're being shipped all over the country. He ended the construction of the wall. He refused to deport any illegal immigrants for the first 100 days. So he terminated the declaration of a national emergency at the southern border, all in one single day. Did we put out a message that we wanted illegal immigration? Absolutely. And you know all the things that have happened since and how many gotaways have got away. But I wanted to ask something to the sheriff because I don't have time. I'd love to talk on this longer. Kamala Harris was appointed the border czar. So that means she should know this border in and out and in every way, along with Mayorkas. Has she? Have you had a lot of interaction with her? I'm done talking, but can he answer that at least?
Yes, gentleman's time has expired. You may answer that question.
No.
No. I hope everybody heard that. That's the answer. That's the truth.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Recognize the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Escobar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to also join my colleagues, Mr. Dunn, in expressing my heartfelt sympathies and condolences for the loss of your son. Sheriff Daniels, thank you for your service to your community and to our country. And again, Judge Samaniego, I'm so grateful for your compassionate and strategic leadership and your partnership with the federal government. Really appreciate your testimony here as well. You know, for anyone who really truly wants to understand what's happening at the border and to depoliticize this, we've got to take a step back and acknowledge that what we have been seeing is an historic refugee crisis impacting our Western Hemisphere. And it started in 2014 as we began seeing record numbers of unaccompanied minors, and it has continued through the years. When folks credit Donald Trump for limiting migration, I want you to look at what the data shows, which is the only time we saw a drop during the Trump administration was in the weeks after the country and the world shut down because of COVID. And the apprehensions began increasing again before the November general election in 2020. So let's operate in truth and facts, or we won't be able to achieve any solutions together. And I'll tell you, there's no one who wants a safe, secure, well-managed border than those of us who live and work on the border, than those of us who raise our children on the border, those of us who have pledged our service to the border. So to my Republican colleagues, I will work with anyone who wants to achieve what I hope we all want to achieve. And so how do we do that? How do we solve this challenge? I'll tell you how we don't do it. We don't keep doing more and more of the same. The definition of doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is insanity. What have we been doing for decades in America? We've been addressing immigration as a border-only issue, and that is an expensive failure. So how do we solve this? Number one, Congress needs to open up legal pathways. We haven't done that in decades. For many of these migrants, there is no line for them to get into. There's no right way for them to use except for asylum, which is legal. We should also recognize that our country needs immigrants. I don't know about you all, but every CEO I talk to says we need a labor force. I have had CEOs from different parts of the country tell me, can we have some of those asylum seekers in our community? Because we can't get anybody to go to work. So we need to recognize how advantageous immigration is for America. We also need to modernize our processing and include a federal civilian workforce so that, Judge, you don't have to step in and fill in where the federal government has failed. Most importantly, we can depoliticize this work and work for real solutions. So if we want to end the scourge of fentanyl, I sure wish my Republican colleagues would have voted for the bipartisan infrastructure law, which funds technology at our ports. If you want to help defeat the cartels, fund the president's budget as he applies historic resources to do this. If you want to erode the power of the cartels, advocate to end Title 42. And if you want to secure the border, I sure wish you would have voted for historic funding for the Department of Homeland Security in December. But every member of the Republican Party, every colleague actually on this panel who is a Republican voted against that funding. And in fact, in December, President Biden asked for $5 billion for the Department of Homeland Security. Republicans cut that in half and then voted against it. Judge, in that funding was money for communities like ours, for governments like yours that help partner with us. If the Republicans would have had their way, and if that funding wouldn't have made it to you to help, who or what agency would have been hurt the most?
Oh my goodness, just a fact of not having the funding, obviously everybody gets hurt because now NGOs have to step in without any money. Everything gets shifted away from what they need to do. I can tell you FEMA helping us really took that was such an incredible opportunity for us to be able to shelter, to process, to do the things that we wanted to do in a very organized manner.
And when you can't help, what agency has to pick up the burden? What federal law enforcement agency?
Well, the Border Patrol.
That's
Border
right.
Patrol. They feel, that's why we have such a great relationship, because they know that if we weren't doing our job with the community, they would have to have, there's 1,200, they have 1,200 beds available. Sometimes they got as much as 5,500. When we help them, the flow comes through, they're feeling good about it, and we take all that pressure away from the federal government.
Thank you, Judge. My time has expired. I yield back.
Right now. Before we go to our next interlocutor, I guess, do any of you need a 5 or 10 minute break? We do. Okay, so we're gonna recess for 10 minutes, or the sound of the gavel. We're in recess.
Thing where they were talking from the National Review. People know there's only a couple of them.
We'll be back at, let's just come back at 2.
You don't need to say anything. I just told her.
Okay. Yeah.
on earth. But for nearly a year, brave Ukrainians, from army recruits to retired grandmothers, have exposed just how weak the Kremlin military really is. Because a leader who sends his soldiers into battle with almost no food is weak. An army that gives its recruits instructions to use their weapons taken from Wikipedia is weak. Generals using maps from the 1960s to fight a war in 2022 are weak. Nothing underscores Putin's weakness more than his reliance on the Wagner group of mercenaries, a group that Putin's chef, a former convict, a man sanctioned by the United States, leads like a paramilitary death squad, a group recruiting violent criminals from Russian prisons and sending them into battle as cannon fodder. Human Rights Watch documented one incident in the Central Africa Republic where Wagner mercenaries stopped a group of unarmed men at a roadblock. As the witness began to pray out loud, the Russians forced the men to kneel, and one by one, they shot them in the head. These aren't just criminals, they are war criminals. And they are leading the fight in Ukraine today for Putin because Putin is failing spectacularly. In fact, I'm considering legislation to strengthen our tools to counter the Wagner Group, prohibiting transactions with those buying their natural resources, as well as restricting security assistance to countries supporting this mercenary army. Their reach is growing as Putin gets weaker. And the weaker he gets, the more dangerous he gets, the more suffering he causes. How many civilians will die from Russian missile attacks in Ukraine because Putin can't achieve his battlefield goals? What will Putin do as he gets more desperate? More letter bombing campaigns in NATO countries? Threats of nuclear war? Now, I have been supportive of the administration's response to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, from supplying critical weapons systems and trainings to shoring up our allies in Europe to supporting the millions of refugees who have fled this war, including welcoming so many to the United States. But as I have said all along, this support should have come sooner. Ukraine's embrace of good governance reforms in the years leading up to Russia's invasion directly contributed to the success we're seeing today. And while we are still learning more details, I want to commend President Zelensky and his cabinet for their serious oversight plans for U.S. and international assistance. As I have said since Putin's invasion, and I'll say it again to the Ukrainian people, we will continue to support your heroic efforts to achieve victory. We will stand with you as your fight for your homeland against a dictator trying to erase your nation by force. We will work with you so that a free and democratic Ukraine that respects the will and rights of its people survives and flourishes after this war comes to an end. We will continue to work with those countries Putin threatens, from encouraging energy diversification to shoring up democratic institutions to stop Putin from spreading his poisonous autocratic savagery. And we must also support those Russians who are in prison because they are brave enough to stand up against Putin's war machine. Now, I am disappointed that the administration has not met its statutory deadline to make a determination with respect to Magnitsky sanctions in response to the arrest of Vladimir Kara-Murza. So, Secretary Nuland, I hope you will tell us when we can get a response to our letter on this matter. I look forward to getting a full picture today from this entire panel on what the Departments of State, Pentagon, USAID is doing to support Ukraine and counter future Russian aggression. In the immediate term, I think there is a question that needs to be answered, which is, what is our strategy for helping Ukraine achieve victory? How are we taking lessons from the Ukrainian war to think about preparing ourselves and our partners for potential aggression from Russia in the future? Because while Ukrainians are on the front lines of fighting for democracy and the rule of law now, we know that Putin's ambitions do not end on his borders. The United States and our democratic allies must show the authoritarian regimes of the world that the invasion and subjugation of free people is unacceptable in the modern world. It's a violation of the international rule of law, and that is what is also at stake in Ukraine. Yes, it is about the freedom of the Ukrainian people to decide their own future, but it is also to stand up for the universal proposition that you cannot by force take another country's territory. And with that, let me turn to the distinguished ranking member for his remarks, Senator Risch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me say I concur in the remarks that you have made, and I'm going to make some similar remarks along those lines. I look forward to having a concrete discussion on the Biden administration's policy toward Russia. I hope to hear from you how the United States is planning to do more and faster to help defeat Russia in Ukraine and counter Russian aggression and malign influence around the world. Indeed, we aren't the only ones that are hungry for this. I think if you look around this room and see the attendance today and see the gaggle of media people out in the hall shouting questions at us, everyone is hungry for this discussion. And I hope we have a robust discussion on that today. It's been almost a year ago now that Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine turned the status quo of international relations on its head. In response to this bold escalation, the United States and our allies around the world quickly came to a consensus that we need to support Ukraine's defense of its people, territory, and way of life from Russian aggression. Whenever we have a discussion like this, it really ought to start with a short, very short and brief discussion of how we got here. We all know that Ronald Reagan spent 8 years in his presidency as his top priority, bringing down and breaking up the Soviet Union and pulling those satellite countries away from Russia. He was successful. He got that done. And we, as America, adopted that as our policy. We promoted it. We helped it in every way we can. One of the things that happened, of course, was all the countries that were in the orbit of the USSR pulled away and went on their own way. That breakup included 4 countries that had nuclear weapons at the time. One was Russia, of course, one was Kazakhstan, one was Belarus, and one was Ukraine. Obviously, it's also the policy of the United States to contain nuclear weapons and be against proliferation wherever possible. On December 5th of 1995, the United States sat down in Budapest, Hungary, with the Ukrainians, with the Brits at the table and with the Russians at the table, and entered into an agreement whereby they, that is all of us, asked the Ukrainians to give up their nuclear weapons, in return for which Ukraine would get security for their borders and against an invasion by any country. All 4 of us signed that. The Ukrainians did what they agreed to do. They gave up their nuclear weapons. And where do they find themselves in 2022? Facing an invasion by one of the countries that actually signed that agreement. We have not only a moral obligation, but a legal obligation to do what we said we'd do on December 5th of 1995, and we're doing that. Over the past year, extensive discussions have taken place about how the U.S. and our allies can support Ukraine. That is the conversation of about every conversation you enter into here in D.C. However, these discussions get bogged down by fears of giving Ukraine too much equipment too quickly for fear of upsetting Moscow. I'm tired of hearing that. Everyone talks about the need to hand Russia a strategic defeat in Ukraine, but the administration's policies stop short of fully supporting that goal. What is missing is a more robust discussion about U.S. policy toward Russia now and, just as importantly, beyond the current conflict. Any notion that we can interact with Russia like we did a year ago was shattered by the invasion, but also by Russia's non-compliance with the New START Treaty and many other malign actions it's taken around the world. It has not only soured its relationship with us, it has soured its relationship with virtually the rest of the planet, with the exception of a half a dozen of what I call no good countries that are in league with them. I expect our witnesses to help us better understand the administration's plans to confront all of Russia's malign influence. It is critical that U.S. foreign policy be informed by a long-term vision for a future where Russia coexists with its neighbors and does not threaten to destabilize the international community. Unfortunately, the Biden administration has so far not made clear a concrete policy for how the United States will directly confront Russia as a strategic adversary. While Putin has irreversibly tied the fate of his regime to the outcome of the war in Ukraine, there's so much more to confronting Russia that the United States must consider. It is essential that the Biden administration's Russia policy be characterized by leadership and initiative, I hope your testimony and responses will be given with a focus on that overreaching Russia policy today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Risch. With that, let me turn to our witnesses. A longtime participant with this committee, Undersecretary for Political Affairs, Victoria Newland, has been a diplomat for more than 30 years. She started very young. Among her many accolades, she previously led the Europe and Eurasia Bureau and served as ambassador to NATO and was the State Department's spokesperson. We're also joined by USAID's Assistant Administrator in the Bureau for Europe and Eurasia, Aaron McKee, our former ambassador to Papua New Guinea, to the Solomon Islands, and to the Republic of Vanuatu, who began her career working on the post-Soviet space. And finally, we welcome Assistant Secretary Wallander, who has worked on Russia at the National Security Council and the Pentagon for many years and has published extensively on Russia and Europe while outside of government. So welcome to you all. Your full statements will be included in the record without objection. I'd ask that you try to summarize your statements in about 5 minutes or so that members of the committee can have a conversation with you. With that, Madam Secretary, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Risch, distinguished members of this committee. It's an honor for all of us to join you for this first hearing of the new Congress. It's also appropriate that we're meeting on Ukraine as we approach the one-year anniversary, as you both said. First, let me thank this committee, the entire Congress, for your continued strong bipartisan support for Ukraine's battle for its sovereignty, indeed, its very right to exist. The more than $45 billion in supplemental funding for security, economic, humanitarian support that you approved in December for FY23 confirms for every Ukrainian fighter, medic, teacher, and electricity technician that America stands with them. And we stand with them in saying no to a vicious autocrat trying to redraw the maps of their country by force, and no to any others around the world with similar ambitions. Because Ukraine's fight, as you have both said, is about so much more than Ukraine. It is about the world that our children and our grandchildren will inherit. Since I last sat before this committee in September, Ukraine has regained control of large swaths of its territory in Kherson and in Kharkiv with strong US and international support. It has held the line so far in Bakhmut, albeit at very high costs, but taken losses in the surrounding towns in Soledar. It has valiantly withstood Putin's latest barbaric tactic, waves of drone and missile attacks on its heating, electricity, and water infrastructure, and with your help has begun to build back and modernize its systems. As you know, there was another vicious attack in 4 cities last night, taking out heat and electricity for millions of Ukrainians. Ukraine is already building that back. And Ukraine has also put forward a set of principles for a just and sustainable peace and challenged Russia to engage meaningfully around that framework. And in just the last 2 weeks, in addition to last night, it has grieved the losses of so many more innocents. Russian missiles destroyed an apartment in Dnipro, and as you know, Ukraine lost senior members of its government in a tragic helicopter crash. Ukraine's fight must and will continue because, as my boss, Secretary Blinken, has said so often, if Russia stops fighting, this war ends today. But if Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine ends. That's also the message that all of you heard from President Zelensky when he made his historic visit to the Oval Office on December 21st and also addressed the joint session of Congress. As Putin continues to pour pain on Ukraine, Ukraine is fighting back with our support. As Assistant Secretary McKee and Assistant Secretary Wallander will outline in more detail, we and our allies are working with Ukraine now to get them the training, the equipment, and the support they need to defend themselves and to make another concerted effort this spring to push back Russian forces. This includes providing the Patriot air defenses, counter-drone systems, Abrams main battle tanks, the Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, Stryker, artillery, and ammunition. We and our partners are also speeding equipment and spare parts to Ukraine to rebuild and harden its critical infrastructure, including a gas turbine provided by AID just yesterday that's the size of a tennis court. We're also providing budget support, economic and humanitarian assistance, and supporting those collecting evidence of Russia's atrocities and crimes so there can be full accountability. Throughout this, the administration remains laser focused on ensuring that no aid or weapons are diverted. We have plumped up our embassy staff in Kyiv for technical oversight. We are also working with the World Bank, with Deloitte, and with a team of US government auditors who are in Kyiv this week, in fact. And we continue to support essential reform and anti-corruption measures by the Ukrainian government across the country. Ukraine must not simply survive this war, it must emerge stronger, cleaner, more democratic, more European. That's what Ukraine's patriots are fighting for. That is also central to the support that the United States and our international partners provide. President Zelensky's decision this week to fire and accept the resignations of officials suspected of corruption sends a strong signal of Ukraine's own resolve in this regard. In the meantime, our coalition of support for Ukraine remains amazingly strong. In total, more than 50 partner nations have committed tens of billions of dollars in military, economic, humanitarian support and taken in millions of refugees. We've also worked, as you know, on the Black Sea grain deal, 17 million metric tons liberated from Port of Odessa. And we've helped Europe reduce its dependence on Russian fossil fuel, more than doubling our own LNG exports to the continent. And we've imposed far-reaching sanctions and a global price cap on Russian oil to reduce revenues for Putin's vicious war machine without destabilizing energy markets.
Yeah.
None of this, none of what we've seen would have been in Ukraine over the past year, would have been possible without daily acts of heroism by tens of millions of Ukrainians in all walks of life. But it's also true that much of it would have been impossible without the continued support of the Congress and the American people. President Biden has pledged that the U.S. will support Ukraine for as long as it takes, and we are grateful for the partnership that we have with you in meeting this commitment because it's in our own national interests. We look forward to taking your questions.
All right, it seems like the part of the Wagner Group is trying to interfere with our hearing here. So we will, it seems like it may have stopped, so that's good. All right. Administrator McKee.
Thank you, Chairman Menendez, Ranking Member Risch, distinguished members of this committee. I deeply appreciate the opportunity to testify about USAID's work to support the people of Ukraine and our wider efforts to counter Russian aggression throughout Europe and Eurasia. I also have to thank you for passing the 4 supplemental appropriations bills that allow the United States to present such a strong, united front in assisting Ukraine. Today, as we've noted, marks 335 days of the Kremlin's senseless, brutal war on Ukraine. Close to 8 million Ukrainians are now refugees. 5.9 million Ukrainians are internally displaced. Some 430 children have been killed, and USAID partners have documented over 20,000 instances of alleged war crimes and human rights abuses. Putin's unjustified war continues to cause catastrophic loss of life and has undermined the security of Europe and the global economy. And yet, Putin drastically underestimated the Ukrainian people. The government of Ukraine still stands strong and capable. The Ukrainian people demonstrate daily heroism and bravery. Communities emerging from occupation exemplify this resilience despite the horror that they have endured. At USAID, we are proud to stand beside the Ukrainian people in their fight for freedom. Foreign assistance is a critical tool to realize the United States' goals of helping Ukraine win its war for survival and achieve a lasting victory as a free, prosperous, independent country with a path towards EU accession. Ukraine will need a well-functioning state, a vibrant, inclusive economy, a free press, and strong institutions free from corruption to secure this future when the war ends. The supplemental resources generously appropriated by Congress allow USAID to address urgent needs immediately created by the conflict, while also remaining focused on what will be needed for recovery and reconstruction. With these funds, we are investing in Ukraine's economy and helping resuscitate it after the Kremlin's ruthless attacks on its civilian infrastructure. We are repairing the country's energy and heating systems to counter Putin's attempts to wield the harsh winter as a weapon against the people of Ukraine. We are protecting public health from the deadly consequences of Russia's war and support Ukraine's health system to restore services while at the same time advancing progress on critical reforms. And we continue to fight corruption at every level to build public trust, maintain that trust as well as donor support, attract critical private sector investment, safeguard the country's institutions, and speed its integration with the rest of Europe. We have also delivered on the United States' commitment to provide reliable and sustained economic support to the Ukrainian government, which is critical to ensuring that Ukraine can defend itself and uphold the democratic government and society that is at the core of Putin's aggression against Ukraine. The $13 billion in direct budget support that USAID has provided thus far to the government of Ukraine through generous congressional appropriations has kept government services such as healthcare, education, and basic utilities running. This support has made it possible for the Ukrainian people to sustain their resolve even as Putin weaponizes winter with unrelenting attacks on the country's energy grid. USAID appreciates the fundamental responsibility being entrusted with these U.S. taxpayer funds. Ensuring oversight of U.S. taxpayer dollars used to meet critical needs of Ukrainian citizens is USAID's priority for all budget support provided to the Ukrainian government. And the Ukrainian government stands as our partner in this accountability and knows we will be exercising extraordinary measures to track these funds. Beyond the region, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is harming the global economy and worsening global food insecurity due to disruptions to food, fuel, fertilizer supplies, and subsequent price volatility. As Russia becomes more aggressive in its energy policy, countries like Moldova are facing much higher prices and consequently are accelerating their transition to other energy sources with US government assistance. The countries in Central Asia are also facing serious disruptions to their economies and food security and are seeking alternatives to Moscow, which USAID is working to support through regional cooperation. The consequences of Putin's unprovoked, unjustified war in Ukraine extend beyond the battlefield, beyond Ukraine, and beyond Europe. USAID will continue to stand with the Ukrainian people, and we are grateful for the support from Congress. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. Secretary Wallander.
Chairman Menendez, Ranking Member Rich, distinguished members of the committee, it is an honor to appear before you today to express the unwavering support of the United States for Ukraine's sovereignty and security in the face of Russia's unprovoked and brutal invasion. Thank you for holding this important hearing at this pivotal time for the security of Ukraine, of Europe, and of the world. As Secretary Austin said at the Halifax Security Forum this past November, our support for Ukraine's self-defense is an investment in our own security and prosperity. What happens in the coming months may prove decisive, and we are focused on providing Ukraine with the military capabilities it needs to defend its people and its territory. We are doing this in close cooperation with our allies and partners. First, we have focused on a layered, integrated approach to air defense to counter Russia's devastating attacks on Ukraine's population centers and civilian infrastructure. The Patriot capability from the United States, Germany, and the Netherlands will give Ukraine advanced long-range capability. These are complemented by the medium and short-range air defense capabilities, such as NASAMS and Avenger, that we have provided. Second, to enhance Ukraine's ability to maneuver, the United States will provide Abrams main battle tanks, the best tanks in the world. The United Kingdom has also committed Challenger tanks, and other European states will provide Leopard tanks. These main battle tanks are complemented by other vital armor capabilities, such as Bradleys and Strykers from the United States, Swedish CV-90s, French AMX-10s, and German Martyrs. Third, we have expanded US-led collective training to enable the Ukrainians to integrate fires and maneuver. Our training will complement the specialized training conducted by the United States, the European Union, and our allies. And finally, we continue to work with allies and partners to deliver a steady flow of artillery rounds and other ammunition so Ukraine can sustain its fight. Russia has discovered that the United States and our allies and partners are serious about supporting Ukraine for the long haul. Our assistance to Ukraine is possible thanks to bipartisan support from Congress. The Department of Defense appreciates the most recent additional Supplemental Appropriations Act, which provided presidential drawdown authority, funding for the military services to replace items sent to Ukraine, and funding for the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, or USAI. Presidential drawdown allows us to get Ukraine critical capabilities quickly. USAI allows us to contract with industry for new and innovative solutions while building Ukraine's longer-term defense. We are also ramping up defense industrial base production of critical munitions and equipment, doubling or in some cases tripling capacity. Even as we focus on getting Ukraine what it needs, we have always prioritized accountability, and Ukraine has too. We have adapted our accountability practices for the combat environment to address the risk of illicit diversion using mechanisms that go above and beyond our standard practices. The US government has not seen credible evidence of any diversion of US provided weapons outside of Ukraine. Instead, we see Ukraine's frontline units effectively employing security assistance every day on the battlefield. Nearly a year ago, Russia launched its brutal invasion to destroy Ukraine as a free and sovereign nation, threatening European security and transatlantic unity. Today, NATO is stronger, Europe is investing in its own security at record rates, and the incredible people and armed forces of Ukraine remain unbowed and unbroken. This war has demonstrated that aggression is not worth the price paid by the aggressor. That is a lesson that should reverberate around the world, including among autocratic leaders everywhere. As Secretary Austin has said, free people always refuse to replace an open order of rules and rights with one dictated by force and fear. We are determined to support Ukraine's fight against tyranny and oppression, and in doing so, to defend the American interests and values that are so clearly at stake. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you all for your testimony. We'll start a round of 5-minute questions, and let me make some prefatory remarks before I go to my questions here. I'm all in and have been since 2014 when I, waved my saber and said we should be far more responsive to the invasion of Crimea because it was the warning sign. And the world, including the United States, was relatively mute in its response to the invasion annexation of Crimea. And so then Putin got the message that you can march on. And that's part of what's at stake now, that he can march on. Now, there are those I know who have an insular view and others who have a legitimate question. And as someone who, back at home in New Jersey, when I'm asked by my constituents, why are we spending so much money on Ukraine? I make the point to them that, in fact, what is at stake is not only the Ukrainians' freedom, which in and of itself is important, but also the proposition that you cannot by force take another country's territory. Because if that can become the rule of the day, there are many despots and authoritarians who will seek to do that. China in Taiwan,
North Korea, possibly against South Korea. The list is endless. But having said that, I would commend to you, Madam Secretary, to speak to the Secretary and to the administration, that I think it's important that we articulate what is our definition of victory and what is the blueprint for victory in order to continue to have the bipartisan support of Congress for the resources that will be necessary to achieve that victory. I think that's critically important. Not saying that we don't have one, but it hasn't been well articulated if there is one. And if there isn't a full vision of what that blueprint is, we should be thinking about what it is and how we execute on it. With that, and we also, I'm a strong supporter, I have voted for everything for the Ukrainians and passed legislation going back to 2014. But we also have to tell our friends in Ukraine, you can't sell white phosphorus to the Azerbaijanis that kill Armenians. There are responsibilities as well, not just the opportunity to receive resources. My first question is about sanctions, and it is particularly about China. As you well know, President Putin met with Chinese President Xi Jinping in February of 22, where they touted their no-limits partnership, just weeks before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Since that time, I understand there's been evidence that Chinese companies, including working through Hong Kong, have been exporting dual-use technologies, including semiconductor chips, which are critically important to fill in, particularly on missile guidance systems that Russia needs to continue its onslaught of Ukraine. It seems to me that we should not forsake the potential of sanctions against China if it is providing critical assistance. And it shouldn't be able to hide behind some companies. Have we raised these concerns at the highest levels of the Chinese government? Is this support from China to Russia not a direct violation of U.S. sanctions?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for your strong personal support for Ukraine and your perfect articulation of what's at stake here, which the president agrees with, as he said yesterday. With regard to China, yes, from well before this latest invasion began in November and December even of 21, we began an intense conversation with China at every level, which the president himself has led, and all of our senior leaders have been involved in, with regard to their relationship with Russia and about their own interests, in our view, in upholding the UN Charter and not allowing Putin-style rules of the road to dominate. And we've made clear that we will bring to their attention when we see sanctions violations by their companies. And we've been very clear with regard to the impact on our relationship and their standing in the world.
I just don't think that we have followed up those conversations with robust sanctions against companies that are providing dual-use technology that is allowing the Russians to continue to have access to missile capabilities that we should not let them have. It seems
Chairman,
to
I
me
would
that,
just-
you know, we need to, in addition to all the money that we are providing, all the defense equipment we're providing, we need to cut the head of the snake off in every way we can. And that means sanctioning it directly and its inner core, which I give the administration credit for, but it also means sanctioning those vigorously who are assisting Russia in this unjust and unholy war. And so I hope we will be far more robust in that regard. I don't care that it's China, I don't care who it is. At the end of the day, they cannot act with impunity and face no consequence.
We agree with that, Chairman, and we have a new set of sanctions out today, which I think you will see some of the things that you've been calling
I look
for,
forward to that.
particularly with regard to.
I don't know if you're familiar directly with what I mentioned in my opening statement about the Magnitsky letter on Vladimir Kara-Murza. It is past the time statutorily to get an answer. I see no reason why, in fact, we cannot in essence, have sanctions against someone who's one of Russia's biggest critics, Putin's biggest critics, not Russia's biggest critic, Putin's biggest critics, and is jailed as a result of it, we should make it clear through Magnitsky sanctions. Senator Cardin's been the author of that law. This is an example of what it was meant to use. And so could you get us an answer, please?
We're not only going to get you an answer, we're going to get you Magnitsky sanctions in very short order.
Bravo, bravo, bravo. All right, now, lastly, you know, what are we doing as it relates to the need for some of us went to The Hague earlier last year to press the case on sanctions and prosecutions against those who are committing war crimes. There must be accountability, and accountability without prosecutions is not accountability. Are we focused on that as well?
We are, Chairman. We have a G7 working group of lawyers as well as the group of G7 political directors that I'm involved in looking at various models of accountability. There are 3 or 4 under consideration. I think we'll have more to say about that as we approach the anniversary in terms of the actual setting up of judicial proceedings. But in the meantime, and Aaron can speak to this in more detail, we are involved in supporting all kinds of accountability mechanisms on the ground in Ukraine, everything from collecting evidence to supporting the cataloging of atrocities, et cetera. And we're working with the Ukrainians on some interim measures of registries of attack, et cetera, that could be used for future accountability. I don't know if Erin has anything she wants to add there.
Thank you, Senator. We are working very closely on the ground through our human rights and access to justice centers that have a network throughout Ukraine, over 22 locations, to gather and document the evidence for such time to be able to, as you said, prosecute and hold accountable those actions inside Ukraine. So we aren't waiting for the determination for that process to be set up, but preparing all we can so that when it is in place, swift and appropriate due process can be made and the evidence is available.
The earlier that possible prosecutions are prosecuted and successfully done will send a chilling effect to those who think they can act with impunity. Senator Rick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Nuland, what you said there are going to be new sanctions out today. Who are those going to be against? Who are the targets of those sanctions?
Ranking Member-ish, there are more than 40 sanctions coming out. They may actually have been published at about 10:30. The vast majority of them are against Prigozhin and the Wagner Group in Africa. There are also sanctions against Putin's cronies, against those who provide material support to Russia's military-industrial complex. And then there is one in particular that addresses the chairman's question with regard to China.
Yeah, the chairman and I have both been anxious to see what's happening with China, because China seems to be acting with impunity, and that we really need to ratchet up our sanctions in that regard. They may be big, but they're not too big to fail in that regard, and we really need to ratchet sanctions up there. Also, Secretary Nuland, first of all, I think most of us here were glad to see that finally the administration yesterday agreed to provide Abrams tanks. And we've been calling for this for some time. But we've been repeatedly told over the months that sending tanks to Ukraine was not possible or desirable or would somehow be escalatory. And all of a sudden it changed yesterday. How did that, this is embarrassing. How did that change? What happened?
Well, I'm going to let Assistant Secretary Wallner talk about the internal discussion inside the Pentagon. What I will say to you, Ranking Member, is that Abrams, as you know, are very sophisticated tanks and they require significant training. So even as we approved them yesterday, it's going to take some time to get them to the battlefield. So this is not something that's going to appear in time for the spring offensive. What is most
Which
needed.
brings it, which underscores what I said. You know, we've been asking for this for 6 months. Had you started 6 months ago, they'd be all ready for the spring offensive. So what happened here? Who's to blame for this?
You know, I think at every stage of this, we have looked at what the Ukrainians have needed, what they've been requesting. There was a period in the fall where they were capturing a huge number of Russian tanks on the battlefield, which they were able to use successfully in the Kherson and Kharkiv offensive, but now they need more. And so we are responding.
Well, it didn't answer the question, but I guess we're not going to get an answer to that question. But I got to tell you, it's all through this thing we've been pressing the administration to do things, and usually they do the right thing, but it takes forever to get there. And as a result of that, there's a great loss on the battlefield and lives lost in the meantime. So I want to underscore that the administration truly needs to act more rapidly. That brings us, Secretary Walter, to the Stryker combat vehicles. As we all know, there's different versions of the Stryker vehicles, and one of the things that the Ukraine's been asking for is the Strykers that are equipped with the cannons that are comparable to those found on tanks. But the administration's declining to give them those. They're giving them something with only machine guns and no heavy weapons, and they're really not much more than an armored taxi cab. What's going on there? Can we expect a reversal of that, hopefully, in the near future?
Senator, I do not have information on the specific variant of Stryker vehicles, APCs, as you refer to. What I will say is that
You do know that they're not going to, they've decided, or at least they're telling us, they're not going to give them the ones with the cannons that are found on the tanks.
I would need to validate that, Senator. But I will speak to the value of the Stryker capability and the volume of the Stryker capability.
We know the value of the Stryker capability, and we know how much it's enhanced if it's got a cannon on it instead of machine guns. So I'm not really interested in that part of the answer, but again, I would urge you, and I suppose the way things go, eventually they'll do it, but they need to do it, and they really need to do it rapidly. Well, my time's almost up. At some point in time, we need to have a really good discussion of what's going to happen when this is over. It will be over at some point in time. Either the Russians will quit fighting, the Ukrainians will quit fighting. Neither one of them are near that point at this point. But what's going to happen in the future? Look, we're not going to go back to doing business with Russia as we have before. And so as a result of that, we need to talk about how we're going to interact with Russia. The Europeans are already doing that. When they come to see me, they've already got blueprints as far as how they're going to change directions. So I'd like to hear how we're going to change directions. With that, my time's up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Cardin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank our three witnesses, not just for their testimony today, but for your service to our country. I want to follow up on Chairman Menendez's last point first, and that is accountability. Tomorrow is Holocaust Remembrance Day, 77th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. I appreciate and believe we're making substantial progress in maintaining the evidence to pursue war crimes or crimes against humanity for those that are responsible at the highest levels. Early action is going to be important. Is there any hope that we could move forward with some recognized international mechanism that could start the process so that it's known internationally that accountability is going to be part of the resolution of this conflict?
So Senator Cardin, as I said, we're working hard on this with our G7 partners and with Ukraine. What we want
I
to do
understand
is
you're working on gathering the evidence. and
no,
things like that.
also on which of the various models for
So what's the
pursuing
timing
justice.
on that?
You know, I would like to see us come to conclusion before the anniversary in around February, but it may take another few months, but certainly before the summer, I would hope.
And
I would also note that when I was out with the secretary in Kyiv in September, we went to Irpin to see one of the towns that had been decimated by Russian missiles. And we met with some of the non-governmental organizations that AID is supporting who were minutely gathering evidence and plotting it. So
No, I appreciate the
Yes.
fact I've been actually briefed on some of the evidence that's actually been obtained.
Yep.
It's My concern is, will we have a mechanism that will allow the international community to observe that accountability is actually being pursued? Such as like the Nuremberg trials after World War II. Are we going to have some mechanism like that? If I understand your answer, we should know that in the next couple of months.
That is our aspiration, and, in another setting, I can brief you on the various options we're considering.
I appreciate that. I'll pursue that. You've mentioned the Wagner, we've all mentioned the Wagner Group several times. And as I understand, there will be some additional sanctions in regards to those involved in the Wagner Group. You have taken certain steps to designate them as an international criminal group. You haven't designated them as a foreign terrorist organization. Why not? And what else can we do? Because this is not only a threat to what's going on in Ukraine, this is a global threat. What else can we do to show that we are doing everything we can to protect against the growth of this type of an organization?
We went, Senator, with the transnational criminal